Hello, and welcome to Leadership as a Philosophy, Not a Checklist, book discussion, or actually this is going to be book review number 1, because I'm transitioning from discussions about leaders and historical books about leaders more to a book review. If I come back to something where I'm talking about a leader in a book, then that'll be that. So this is book review number 1. It's on Leaders by General Stanley McChrystal. So this is sort of an interesting journey for me. I bought this book right when I was trying to collect information when I started my project. So this was actually a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago. Good grief, I can't remember. It might have been 1999 that I bought the book. Read it and was super frustrated because the preface is amazing, which I'll explain in the video. The questions that he asks at the beginning of the book are amazing. I actually was worried that my entire project was going to be a waste of time because he articulated in 2 questions the problem so well that I thought, I'm done. This is the end of it, right? I'm getting ready to do all this work and somebody's already done it. And I was frustrated because the book doesn't answer the questions. Now that we've gone through this whole year together, for those of you that have been on board for the entire time, you'll notice that it's much easier, and it's easier for me to explain my frustration with the book and then also identify the things that I got right and where it's actually good and bad or whatever. Obviously, everything I say is with a ton of respect. I clearly have not written a book, so the fact that somebody can write a book and get it published and all that sort of stuff, it's an amazing effort. Writing's hard. I get that. But at the same time, the great thing about books is that now somebody's thoughts are on paper, so now we can talk about their thoughts, which is great. As with everything, I reached out to the McChrystal group to ask a question if they wanted to do an interview for this. Got no response. So that's fine. I would love to talk to these guys, though, because they ask good questions. And so I think now we've sort of got an answer. Sort of, right? We don't know if it's absolute or not. Anyway, that's it for the intro, and we'll proceed to the 1 PowerPoint slide. And hopefully you guys enjoy. Thanks so much, as always, for tuning in. Hello, welcome to Leadership as a Philosophy, Not a Checklist. Book discussion 13, Leaders by General McChrystal, Jeff Eggers, and J. Manjon. So I'm just going to get right into the PowerPoint part. So first thing is he writes the preface. And the preface is interesting because he comes up with the idea that, hey, Einstein came up with the general theory of relativity, and what we need is a general theory of leadership. Yes, I'm on board, because we need something that explains what leadership really is, okay? Now, understand that I am not saying that I'm Einstein and that I came up with this. The general theory of leadership has been around for a long time. We have just missed it, right? So he says that there's a difference between what he was taught and what exists. And then instead of, this is where I started getting a little frustrated, because he's sort of saying the right thing, but then makes the wrong conclusion. There's a problem between what we're being taught has been history, or has been leadership throughout history, and what exists. So what has been taught throughout history isn't correct. Whereas, as you know, I am taking the opposite idea, which is what's been taught throughout history is correct. What has been written down about historical figures and historical leaders is correct. And what we're teaching now is wrong. Right? And so I just thought that it was a strange assumption to make that for thousands of years we have all of these examples, and just recently What we're teaching, that's what's right, and what's old is not correct. And it's frustrating because it's easy to make that assumption. Well, this is what we see now, so this must be correct. This must be reality. Or is reality really that and we're teaching wrong? It's a two-sided question, right? You can approach it from both angles. But I think that this is where his thought process breaks down a little bit, and I'll show that later on. So I thought that was it's just strange, because if something's going on for all this time, but just now, I mean, look, I'll get myself in a bunch of trouble right now, right? If we've had ice ages and heat waves throughout history, I mean, including several hundred years ago where it was way hotter than it is now, and it's also been way colder than it is now, and you can plot that out with the sun cycles, somehow we're saying right now what we're doing is causing change and not the biggest heat source in the solar system, right? It's sort of hubristic to think, oh, what we're doing now is correct, instead of saying, well, what's history really show us? So, it's like I wish somebody was sitting around with him when he was making this assumption so he could argue that assumption. So then he has this statement, here's these people that did everything, that were doing everything that they were taught and didn't have any success. And then there are leaders that weren't necessarily doing everything that they were taught, but were having success. So take that and make the next assumption, which is we're teaching the wrong thing. What is it that those leaders that weren't doing, quote unquote, the right things, but were successful leaders, what did they do? What were they actually doing? That's where it breaks down, right? So then this is an interesting quote that he has, and I had to write this down to make sure that I got it right, because I didn't want to paraphrase this, because this is where I think that we're just sort of it shows hubris, okay? And I mean no disrespect, right? So the quote starts off with some stuff, and he says, "But too many of us, seduced by the mythology of what good leadership looks like, miss the reality. As a result, our models for identifying, educating, and evaluating leaders falter or feel incomplete. We intuitively know that leadership is critical to success in the modern world, but we don't really understand what leadership consists of." Well, let's go back and look at the myth. Are we really teaching the myth? Are we really teaching the historical representations of leadership? No, of course we're not. Because if we were, then we would have different things. And so, yes, intuitively, we identify, educate, and evaluate leaders incorrectly because we're not teaching the old ways. We're not, and when I say old ways, we're not teaching the history. We're not teaching the character plus the talent plus, wisdom. That's it. That's what we should be teaching, but we're not. And so it's like, okay, well, here's the problem. This begs another question. It's like we're still not at low enough resolution, or high enough. We're still not at a high enough resolution with this statement. Yeah. And like I said, I mean no disrespect. This is the advantage of having somebody put their thoughts on papers. Then you can talk about their thoughts. And so, like I said, I reached out and I would love to have this discussion. So, oops, I think my stupid thing didn't work right. Okay, so actually, you know what? I'm going to skip to that part. So you get to see the whole slide. I'm sorry. So the problem that he runs into is a problem of definition. He doesn't define leadership. And so what happens if we don't define leadership? Then you end up with a whole bunch of problems. And then he talks again. This is reinforcing what's going on up here. Everything throughout history teaches the virtue of humility. Yes. Right? Humility, integrity, empathy, vigilance. These are the 4 essential characteristics, the 4 pillars of your character that you should have. But then you also need to have. Anyway, he says it teaches the virtue of humility, but most organizations have a bunch of narcissists in charge. Yes. Why? Because we're not teaching that humility is important. We're not identifying people with good character. We're not doing like they do at the Taj Hotel in Mumbai and identifying and putting people through evaluations and doing a bunch of other stuff. So yes, we have a problem, which means that we're not teaching the virtues. We say them, but we don't evaluate people to see if they're doing them. So we keep promoting people that make money but aren't good leaders. Sorry. Anyway, and then we go with this myth. And throughout the book, he talks about myth. Well, him and his co-authors or authors talk about myth. Well, let's look at the definition of myth, right? The way he uses myth is it's some esoteric thing that's like a fairy tale, right? But if you look up the definition, as we've done with other words, right, like leadership and philosophy and all this stuff, myth is a traditional, typically ancient story dealing with supernatural beings, okay, so a fairy tale, ancestors, okay, or heroes that serves as a fundamental type in the worldview of a people by explaining aspects of the natural world or delineating the psychology, customs, or ideals of society. So when he says myth, yes, we're teaching the myth of leadership, but not that it's false, not that it's fake. This is another one that I found just recently, and it just floored me, right? Myth are symbolic stories about perennial patterns that are always with us. So leadership is a perennial pattern that is always with us. Perennial, yearly, multi-year, multi-thousand years, multi-hundreds, tens of thousands of years, however long we've been conscious, right? And so the myth of leadership is the correct thing. The stuff that we're teaching now has nothing to do with the myth. We're teaching people now, drive your people, get your numbers, go out there and drive change, and go out there and you know what's right, and blah, 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 blah. None of that's leadership, right? Of course, we're not teaching leadership now. And the frustration is, since they didn't spend a good time trying to, talk about what the word myth means, using that word is correct. And he talks about it, and he means a fairy tale, but the word myth is correct because it's talking about the perennial pattern that's always with us. All right. So, like I said, I'm sorry I skipped ahead. I built my slide wrong. When you check things and then they don't check, that sort of thing. So he profiles 12 people, and basically they did it in this way where it was, here's 2 people that fit this sort of mold. And it was fine. So 9 people, since we didn't define leadership, right? 9 people just ended up people that rose to the top of their specific competence hierarchy. So he does Disney, Coco Chanel, Einstein, Robespierre, al-Zarqawi from Iraq. I forget who the Chinese person was. It's like Zheng He, but I forget what they were popular for. I'm sorry. Harriet Tubman, Boss Tweed, Martin Luther, right? So these were people that had big ideas, and so they were leaders in their field, right? Disney, Chanel, Robert Einstein. Robert Einstein was not a leader of people. And this is where the definition gets in problem. Are we talking about leading thought people in their field? Fine. But since we didn't come up with a good definition, then we end up with a whole bunch of confusion. You see what I mean? This is why you got to be precise in your speech. Somebody said that, don't know who. I do, Jordan Peterson. So then, if we take what we have studied over the past year and gone through and proven, the people that actually were leaders were Leonard Bernstein, Margaret Thatcher, and Martin Luther King. Right? Now, what's the thing that we always talk about with leaders? That Bernstein is somebody I'm going to have to do, but it's hard wrapping your hands around somebody that was as incredible as him. But Bernstein, spent a bunch of his time. Most of the videos that you can find of him are him teaching young people's concerts when he was doing stuff at Tanglewood. Most of the stuff you see is him teaching people things. Here's what this means. Here's how to think about this. Here's how to go through it. Unbelievable. And then 3 people that worked for him. So Michael Tilson Thomas, who was the conductor of the San Francisco Orchestra. Marin Alsop, and good grief, I'm having a hard time remembering everybody's names. I did his book. Wynton Marsalis, right? All mentored with and studied under Leonard Bernstein. He identified and worked with them. And then what did they end up doing? They all ended up doing videos where they were teaching people things. Michael Tilson Thomas did a whole thing where he did specific concerts. It's Keeping Score. You go look him. It's an amazing series. He does all of this research into a particular piece of music, and then they perform it. And then Marin Alsop, we saw her. She decided that she wanted to get all the inner city kids doing stuff with music, and so started up a thing to educate kids. Amazing, right? This leadership. So Bernstein had that effect on all these people. Margaret Thatcher, right? Might have had some problems as a person, unbelievable human being, humility and integrity. We can measure all that sort of stuff. Had the talent, did a bunch of stuff. Shouldn't have stayed around as long as she did. Maybe should have, decided to step down. And then Martin Luther King Jr., right? So of those 12 people that he profiled, only 3 of them were what we would consider leaders. The rest were just really good at something. And so the reason that so he confuses the whole subject by doing this. Now, the write-ups on these people are neat for historical purposes. So if you want to look at a cool character profile book, this is great for that. And then I wanted to talk about this, and I don't think this is going to get me in trouble. I think I don't know, we'll see. It's my perspective. Once again, he was able to put some words down, so I got something to say. I'm sure whenever I get my book done, somebody's going to have something to say about it too. So in Odd Bit Introspection, he tells a story about how he was a big fan of Robert E. Lee, went to West Point. His wife bought him a picture. I think it was the first painting the first picture that they had in their house, and it was Robert E. Lee. He was really cool, fell in love with the myth, the legend, the story of Robert E. Lee and all this sort of stuff. And then, as he found out more and more and more, decided that, if we want to use the term nowadays that's so hot button, he was problematic. And so then he decided he was going to take it down from his house. Okay. All right, so we're just going to eliminate that. And here's the reason that I say it's a problem. I would have kept it up. Because of course Robert Lee had issues. Of course there were problems. But guess what? So does every other stinking human being on the planet. There is nobody that is ideal. There is nobody that is as perfect as they're portrayed in history, right? Nowhere at any time. So there's a whole bunch of lessons to learn. And so when you're a leader, you got to teach the lessons, even when they're about yourself. So I'd keep it up. Somebody walks in, oh, Robert E. Lee. You say, well, let me tell you the story. And then an hour and a half later, you've explained this mind-expanding idea, which is, hey, here was the thing, heard the legend, fell for the legend, and then started to learn about stuff. So here's some of the lessons that you can learn. So it's warning against idolizing any human being. You make anybody your idol, you're in your mind saying, I want to be just like that person. No, you don't, right? You want to be like the best version, the stuff that was great about that person you want to be like. Not the bad stuff, because they've got the bad, right? How many saints were there, right? There's not a whole bunch of people that are saints. And unfortunately, we don't idolize them either. So you shouldn't idolize anybody, okay? Second is to have the humility to admit to whoever the guest in the house is that even though he's a 4-star general, was in the Army over 30 years, commanded all this stuff, did all these legendary things, that he is just as susceptible of falling prey to legends and all this sort of stuff, crazy stories, as anybody else. And that, if you're going to put somebody's picture on the wall, or you're going to do something that says, I think this person's amazing, make sure you know the stuff that wasn't too. Go do your research and find out and say, well, hey, I like what this person said, because look, and I'm not trying to start any problems. There's some things about Martin Luther King Jr. that weren't great. But holy smokes, did he have the right idea on race? That part was 100% correct. Right? Everybody, all these people, Leonard Bernstein had problems. Margaret Thatcher had problems. All these people had problems. But when it came to their vision and their ideas and their leadership, amazing. Unbelievable, right? And so you have to have, there's a balance in every human being. So if you're just saying this person is idolized, then you're gonna fail. You should never idolize a person. So you have that picture on the wall and you talk about it. Right? What else did Robert E. Lee do that was weird? He was kind of indecisive, and he didn't really have some moral statements, and sort of did some things for some feelings, and and then in battle his tactics weren't amazing, and he also was going up against a bunch of Union generals that were incompetent, right? So he had logistics problems, he had tactics, he had orders that was confused. He had a bunch of good generals that worked for him, and so they would win battles because these other generals would take the initiative and whatnot. So then you find out, well, why the heck did Robert E. Lee get this romantic, amazing marble man of character with all these falsehoods in his past? Find that out. Why were we doing that? Were we so desperate to find something good out of a terrible war? I don't know. But that's how you start that story. Say, look, I fell for it too. All of us can. And then, so then the other thing is, I think I already said this a little bit, but, warning against equivocating, warning against, well, maybe this and maybe that, maybe this, maybe that, there's a lot of lessons to be learned from somebody like Robert. It's like if I were to put a picture of Grant on the wall, he was an alcoholic. Well, alcoholic. He drank a lot. He owned a slave at some point. I think he had a slave or two. And he let him go. Okay, right? It was a nutty time. But Grant also, slaughtered some people too. But if you go and read his memoirs, he's got some good things to say. So let's find the good and the bad in that. So that's the story that you learn. You just take it down. Well, I'm embarrassed that I made this mistake, so I'm not going to tell anybody about it. That's how you learn. That's wisdom. That's mentorship. Anyway. Okay. And then we come to the epilogue. And then there's another thing that was a little frustrating is they get to the end of these profiles. And then they say, well, we, unfortunately, there weren't any women examples of leaders except for Margaret Thatcher and Coco Chanel. I was going, wait, there was a whole bunch of leaders of countries you could have looked into. There was a whole bunch of women leaders. You go back several centuries, you go Boudicca. You got all these women leaders that there's legends about. You could have looked at any of those. So don't say that there weren't any women leaders. That's ridiculous, right? But then we come to the epilogue. And the epilogue, I think, is what frustrated me the most about the book. Because in this book, or at the end of this book, he writes down, well, I don't understand leadership. Okay, good. Humility. And then he says, basically, I'm paraphrasing, of course. Then he says, I thought that it would be applying all of these systems. I'm supposed to be a leader expert. I've been to all these combat things, and I've got all this schooling, and I've done all this stuff. But what I found is that sometimes I'll make a decision this day, and the next day I got to make a completely different decision, even though most of the conditions are the same, but only one has changed. Or if I make the same decision 2 days in a row, the second day that decision might fail because I didn't take into account the variables. So then what I starts to realize is that every day things are different. Every day things are different. There's no checklist for leadership. There's no system for leadership. Well, there's none of this stuff. And so he doesn't understand leadership at all. Well, he's just described leadership. He just described what it is. And the reason I say it's maddening is because this is a super smart guy. He's been and done schools that I've never been to. And he writes that down. And so then it's like, well, take that epilogue and try to answer all of the questions. Because if you take that and align it with the myth, he's doing the myth of leadership. The reason that he looks so amazing and so incredibly decisive and so self-assured and all this sort of stuff is because he makes decisions in chaos, right? We've given the example before. I've got, here's zero, here's really good. I'm looking at the camera to make sure I'm in frame. learning all these camera techniques. So here's really good, and here's really bad. And you've got 3 choices, and they're all over here. And each one is 5% less bad than the other. Well, as a leader, you have to make a decision. Pick one. So then everybody's going to criticize you because you made a decision. Well, I can't believe you made that terrible decision. Well, the only options I had were worse. That's impossible. Well, you weren't there. And that's the problem, right? Is we're trying to teach people a bunch of systems and numbers and process. He even talks about economics in the not the epilogue, but the final chapter, that there's this guy that came up with behavioral economics because he started to realize that humans don't behave according to a system, right? So the the general theory of leadership should be, here's how people behave in spite of whatever cool systems you put in place, which is philosophy, which is psychology, which is human nature, which is all the things that's missing. We've gone so completely out of balance. All we're teaching is numbers and systems and processes, and we're not teaching humanity at all. At all. And so it's like, I would love to sit there and have a, what is it? Is it the Socratic Method? To keep asking why? You should think that I should go get a PhD in philosophy before I tried this, because I need to do a whole lot of that, because I'm just as guilty as everybody else. I was looking at all these numbers and going, numbers don't work. And all of a sudden, that's where leadership as a philosophy came from. But the Socratic Method, keep asking why. Well, if you did it and it worked, he did say one thing that I thought was funny. He says, well, if you're in a battle and your tactics are wonky, they're stupid, but they work, then they weren't stupid. So then he says, well, if you lead poorly and it still works, is it still bad leadership? Yes. And that's where I've said it a bunch of times, right? Here's the way that you're going to approach a situation. I have all of these problems. I'm going to use humility, integrity, empathy, and vigilance. I'm going to use those character pillars and the talent to approach each one of those problems. I didn't even tell you what the problems were. But you say, no matter what, I'm not going to violate my integrity. No matter what, I'm not going to lose vigilance of the people. Under no circumstances am I going to just make some haphazard, off-the-cuff, random decision. And then you go and solve those problems. It takes a unique person to be able to do that, because you got to be super creative. You can't teach that mathematically. Anyway, so the epilogue is a great question, and it should have been at the beginning. And then it would have solved a whole lot of other problems, because it's like there's nothing in common about these people except they were the top of the competence hierarchy, which was a problem because of definition. So it's a cool book about, if you want to get some character profiles, it's a pretty good book for that. As far as answering leadership questions, it asks a great question at the end. So that's that. Sorry, trying not to go too long. So here's the book, published October 23rd. I guess I bought this. I'm thinking I got this at the beginning of 2019. That's what I think. I guess I could go look it up. But yeah, so I didn't get this right when it came out. But yeah, it's a little frustrating. But if you've got the idea right, then suddenly a bunch of those questions get answered. Anyway, as always, thank you very much for your time. If you've made it this far through the video, if you've got questions, comments, want to collaborate, leadership is a philosophy, periods in between, @gmail.com. And soon I will be launching my website where I'll have links to all these sort of things that I've done. All right, thanks so much, and you take care.